What kind of world makes a 7-year-old girl believe that $5 can buy a miracle from a man everyone else is afraid of? The rain fell softly over Koreatown, turning the neon lights into blurred streaks of red and blue across the wet pavement. And in the reflection of that glass and steel building stood a child who did not belong there. Her small sneakers soaked, her thin jacket clinging to her arms, her fingers trembling as they held onto a single crumpled bill like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart, and maybe it was. Amara Johnson had never seen a place like this up close, only heard whispers from adults who lowered their voices when they said his name. A man who fixed problems no one else could fix. A man who made things disappear or reappear depending on what you needed. And tonight she needed something no one had been able to give her. Not the doctors, not the neighbors, not even the church down the street that smelled like old wood and quiet prayers, so she stood there staring at the towering glass doors, gathering the kind of courage that doesn't come from age but from desperation. And she stepped forward. The security guard barely looked at her at first, his attention drifting somewhere over her head like she was just another shadow passing through the rain. But when she spoke, her voice small yet steady, it made him pause just long enough to notice the red in her eyes, the way her breath caught between words, and the hand she held out with $5 pressed flat against her palm like an offering. "Is this where powerful people fix things?" she asked, not demanding, not begging, just asking the way a child asks when they still believe answers exist somewhere if they ask the right person. The guard blinked, confused for a second, then let out a short, dismissive laugh that didn't quite hide the discomfort in his chest, because there was something about the way she stood there, not moving, not flinching, that made it harder than it should have been to send her away. But rules were rules, and this place was not built for children like her. Inside, the lobby glowed with polished marble floors and quiet conversations between people in tailored suits, the kind of space where everything looked expensive and nothing looked like it had ever been broken, and certainly not by someone holding $5. Amara stepped closer to the door, rainwater dripping from her sleeves onto the concrete, her grip tightening around that bill as if she could somehow make it worth more by believing hard enough. And for a moment she hesitated, not because she was afraid of the building, but because she was afraid of what would happen if this didn't work, because if this didn't work, then there was nowhere else left to go. She pushed the door open anyway, stepping into a world that immediately felt too quiet, too clean, too far removed from the hospital room where machines beeped in slow, uncertain rhythms. And as she crossed that invisible line between outside and inside, between powerless and powerful, she didn't know that somewhere above her, behind tinted glass and silent screens, a man who had built his life on control was about to see something he didn't understand, something he would misjudge completely, because to him it would look like just another child with a story, just another problem to ignore. But what he was actually looking at was the beginning of a debt he could never repay. High above the polished silence of the lobby, behind tinted glass that reflected nothing but the city lights, Daniel Kong stood with one hand resting lightly against the edge of a sleek black desk, his gaze fixed on a wall of screens that displayed every angle of the building below, and among those images, one frame had begun to hold his attention longer than it should have, a small figure standing at a counter, unmoving, unyielding, completely out of place in a world designed to filter out people exactly like her, and yet she remained, and that persistence alone irritated him more than it impressed him. He had built his life on patterns, on reading people quickly, on identifying intentions before they were spoken, and from where he stood, the situation seemed simple, a child repeating a story she had been told would work, a performance shaped by desperation or guidance, something he had seen too many times in different forms, and his expression did not change as he watched her place the money down again, as if repeating the gesture might alter its value. "She will leave in a minute," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. But the man standing a few steps behind him nodded anyway, understanding that tone, the one that meant the situation had already been judged and filed away as irrelevant. Daniel turned slightly, pouring himself a small glass of water, the motion controlled, precise, everything about him measured in a way that made unpredictability feel like a flaw, and yet when he glanced back at the screen, the girl was still there, still speaking, still holding on to something that logic alone could not explain. He leaned closer, not out of curiosity, but out of irritation, tapping a command that isolated the audio feed, and her voice filled the room, softer than he expected, but clear enough to cut through the distance. "I can bring more," she said, and something about the way she said it, not hopeful, not naive, but determined in a way that did not match her size, made him pause for just a fraction longer than necessary. He frowned slightly, not because he believed her, but because he did not understand why she believed herself, and that lack of understanding unsettled him in a way he did not immediately recognize. "People like that always promise more," he said, setting the glass down without drinking, his eyes narrowing slightly as if adjusting his focus might reveal something hidden in plain sight. But all he saw was a child in wet clothes holding onto something insignificant, and he exhaled slowly, dismissing the thought as quickly as it had formed. Below, the receptionist shifted in her seat, her patience thinning, her posture tightening as she prepared to end the interaction, and Daniel watched as she reached for the security button beneath the desk. A small motion that signaled the end of the moment, the return to order, the restoration of a space that did not tolerate disruption, and he nodded once, almost unconsciously, as if confirming his own judgment. "Handle it," he said, turning away from the screen, already moving on in his mind to more important matters, numbers, meetings, decisions that carried weight far beyond a single conversation in a lobby. But as he took a step toward the door, something stopped him. Not a sound, not a voice, but a memory that surfaced without permission. A fleeting image of heat and smoke and a hand reaching through it, steady, certain, pulling him back into a world he had not thought about in years, and he froze for just a moment, his hand hovering near the handle, his jaw tightening slightly as he forced the image away. "Irrelevant," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else, and yet when he turned back to the screens, his eyes went immediately to the same frame, the same child, the same $5 bill resting on the counter like something far heavier than it appeared, and for the first time since he had begun watching, Daniel Kong did not immediately look away. The receptionist's fingers hovered over the button for only a second before pressing it. A small motion that carried more authority than her words, and almost immediately the quiet rhythm of the lobby shifted, subtle but undeniable, as two security guards near the entrance straightened and began walking toward the desk with calm, measured steps that suggested this was routine, something practiced, something expected, and as they approached, the conversations around the room resumed with a little more distance, a little more comfort, as if the presence of order restored the illusion that nothing unusual had happened at all. Amara noticed them, of course she did, but she did not step back, did not turn around, did not reach for the door behind her, and instead she looked down at the $5 bill for just a moment, her fingers brushing lightly over its surface as if reminding herself that it was still there, still real, still everything she had brought with her. And then she lifted her eyes again, not to the guards, not to the people watching from the corners of the room, but to the woman behind the desk who had already decided the outcome of this moment. "Please," Amara said again, her voice quieter now, but steadier in a way that made it harder to ignore. "You can keep it even if she dies. Just try." The words did not rise, they did not demand attention, but they landed with a weight that did not match their volume, and for a brief second, the receptionist's expression faltered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that something behind her eyes shifted, something she quickly pushed away as she straightened her posture and folded her hands neatly on the desk as if arranging herself back into control. "You need to leave," she replied, her tone sharper now, less polished, more direct. "This is not a place for you." The guards stopped just behind Amara, close enough that she could feel their presence without them needing to touch her. And one of them gestured toward the door, his voice calm but firm. "Come on, kid, let us go." Amara did not move right away, and in that hesitation, something invisible stretched between everyone in the room. A quiet tension that did not belong in a place built on efficiency and distance, and then slowly, carefully, she reached forward and nudged the $5 bill just a little closer across the counter, as if closing the gap between what she had and what she needed, as if that small movement could bridge something much larger than the space between her hand and the receptionist's. "It is all I have," she said, not apologizing, not explaining, just stating it as a fact that could not be changed. And the simplicity of it made it heavier than any argument she could have made. Above, in the quiet control room, Daniel Kong stopped walking entirely, his attention pulled back to the screen with a force he did not fully understand, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion now, but in something closer to focus, as if the situation had shifted in a way that required reevaluation, and he replayed the last few seconds of audio, hearing the sentence again, slower this time, isolating each word, each pause, each breath between them, and something about it refused to fit into the pattern he had already decided on. "It is all I have," he repeated under his breath, and for the first time, the words did not sound like part of a story. They sounded like the end of one, like something that had already been stripped down to its last piece, and he felt that same brief, unwelcome echo of memory pressing at the edge of his thoughts again. Something about loss, something about a moment when everything had been reduced to a single choice, a single hand reaching out through something he could not fully see anymore. Below, the guard took a step closer, ready to guide Amara away, and the receptionist looked past her already, her attention shifting back to her screen as if the situation had been resolved, as if the child in front of her had already disappeared. But Amara did not pull her hand back, did not take the money, did not move, and for a second that felt longer than it should have, the $5 bill remained exactly where she had placed it, small, damp, and impossibly heavy, and somewhere between. One breath and the next, Daniel Kong realized that he was no longer watching because it was routine. He was watching because something inside that moment did not belong to anything he understood, and that was the first crack. The guard's hand hovered near Amara's shoulder, not touching, just waiting, giving her one last moment to choose before the decision would be made for her. And in that fragile pause, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath again, not out of concern, but out of curiosity, the kind that watches without intervening, the kind that allows things to happen as long as they do not disrupt the order too much, and Amara felt it, that invisible pressure, that quiet expectation that she would finally step back, finally give up, finally accept what everyone else had already decided for her. But instead she looked at the $5 bill one more time, then slowly withdrew her hand, not because she had changed her mind, but because she understood something no one had explained to her, that sometimes the only way to leave something behind is to prove that it was never meant to be taken back. "Please just try," she whispered, softer now, almost to herself, as if the words no longer needed to reach anyone else. And then she turned, her movements small but deliberate, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing against something heavier than the rain outside, and she began to walk toward the glass doors without waiting for the guards to guide her, without looking back to see if anyone had changed their mind, because part of her already knew they would not. The guards exchanged a brief glance, then stepped aside, their presence no longer necessary, the situation resolved in the simplest way possible, and behind the desk the receptionist exhaled quietly, her posture relaxing as she reached for a cloth and wiped the small patch of water left behind on the counter, erasing the evidence of the moment as efficiently as she had dismissed it, her eyes never once returning to the bill that still lay there, untouched, as if it did not belong to anyone anymore. The glass doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and as Amara stepped back into the rain, the world outside felt colder than before, not because the temperature had changed, but because something inside her had shifted, something that had held on to the idea that this place might be different, that this door might lead to something more than another no, and now that idea was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that power did not mean what she thought it meant. The rain fell steadily, tapping against the pavement, soaking into her clothes again within seconds, and as she reached the edge of the steps, her foot slipped slightly on the wet surface, just enough to break her rhythm, just enough for her to instinctively reach out and catch herself. And in that small movement, something slipped from her grasp, something light, something fragile, and when she looked down, she saw that the $5 bill was no longer in her hand. For a second, she froze, her breath catching as her eyes searched the ground, scanning the darkened pavement where the rain distorted everything. And then she saw it, a few steps behind her, caught in a shallow ripple of water near the entrance, slowly flattening against the stone as the rain pressed it down. And she hesitated, not because she did not want to pick it up, but because turning back meant facing the door again, facing the place that had already told her she did not belong. And something inside her resisted that, more than the thought of losing the money itself. Above, Daniel Kong watched the moment unfold in silence, his eyes tracking the small movement, the fall, the hesitation, and something about it felt different from everything that had come before, not louder, not more dramatic, but more real in a way that did not fit into any pattern he had relied on. And when he saw her stop, when he saw her choose not to turn back immediately, he felt that same unfamiliar tension tighten in his chest again. Not sharp, Not painful, just present. Like a question he could not answer quickly enough. The bill lay there, inches from the threshold between inside and outside, between a world that rejected it and a world that could not protect it, and for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, no one moved, not the guards, not the receptionist, not even Amara, and somewhere in that stillness, something invisible shifted, something that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with rules, and everything to do with the choice of whether something small, something insignificant, something easily ignored, would be left where it fell or finally be seen. The rain continued to fall in thin, steady lines, blurring the boundary between the street and the entrance, between what was inside and what had already been pushed out, and Amara stood there at the edge of it, her small frame still, her eyes fixed on the $5 bill lying just behind her, caught in a shallow ripple of water that reflected the glowing lights of the lobby like something distant and unreachable, and for a moment she did not move, not because she did not care, but because she was deciding something far more important than whether to pick it up. She was deciding whether going back was worth the feeling that came with it, the feeling of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. Inside, the receptionist had already turned her attention away, her fingers moving across the keyboard again, restoring the rhythm of her work as if the interruption had never happened, and the guards stood near the door with the relaxed posture of men whose job was finished, their eyes no longer focused on the child but on the space around her, ensuring that everything returned to normal, because normal was what this place protected above all else. Above them all, Daniel Kong did not move, his gaze locked onto the screen that showed the small piece of paper lying between two worlds, and he felt something shift again, not in the scene itself, but in the way he was looking at it, because for the first time he was not observing a situation, he was watching a choice, and choices, he knew, revealed more than words ever could. Amara took a small step forward, away from the door, then stopped, her hand curling slightly at her side as if remembering what it had been holding, and she looked up at the sky for just a second, letting the rain fall across her face without wiping it away, as if it could hide the tears that had not fully formed, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned back. The glass doors reflected her before they revealed her, a faint image of a child returning to a place that had already rejected her, and as she stepped closer, the automatic sensors caught her movement and the doors slid open again with the same quiet sound as before, indifferent to who was entering or leaving, and for a brief moment, she hesitated at the threshold, her eyes flicking from the bill to the interior, from the place that had spoken to her with cold certainty to the small, damp piece of paper that still held everything she had brought with her. Inside, one of the guards noticed her return and straightened slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, because this was not how these moments usually ended. People did not come back once they had been turned away, especially not for something so small, and the receptionist glanced up again, her expression tightening as she recognized the situation repeating itself, something she clearly did not intend to allow. "I told you to leave," she said, her voice sharper now, less controlled, the patience gone, replaced by something closer to irritation, and Amara did not respond right away, did not look at her, did not defend herself. She simply walked the few steps necessary to reach the edge of the threshold and bent down slowly, her fingers hovering just above the water where the bill lay pressed against the stone. And then something unexpected happened, something so small that it almost went unnoticed. The bill did not move when she touched it. It clung to the surface, held down by the weight of the water, and for a second she struggled gently, her small fingers trying to lift it without tearing it, without losing it completely. And in that moment, Daniel Kong leaned forward without realizing it, his hand resting against the edge of the console, his focus narrowing entirely onto that simple action, that quiet struggle, and something about it struck him with a clarity he had not anticipated, because it was not about the money anymore. It was about the refusal to let go of the last thing she had chosen to believe in. The guard took a step closer, ready to intervene again, but stopped when he saw that she was not trying to enter, only trying to retrieve what was hers, and the receptionist watched with visible impatience, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk as if counting down the seconds until this moment would finally end. Amara finally lifted the bill, carefully, holding it between both hands now, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as if she had recovered something far more important than paper, and she straightened, turning back toward the door once more. But before she could take another step, a voice, calm and low, cut through the space behind her. "Why did you come back?" The room did not react immediately. But the weight of that voice settled into the air in a way that made everything else pause, and Amara froze, not because she was afraid, but because something in that question felt different from everything she had heard so far. And above them, Daniel Kong was no longer watching from a distance, because for the first time, he had stepped into the moment himself. The voice did not need to be raised to command attention. It carried its own weight, quiet but absolute. The kind of voice that did not ask questions unless it expected an answer. And when it reached Amara, she did not turn immediately, not out of defiance, but because something in the tone made her pause first, as if she needed to understand what had just changed before she reacted to it. The guards froze where they stood, their posture shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know what to look for, and the receptionist's fingers stopped mid-motion above the keyboard, her expression tightening as she slowly lifted her eyes, already knowing who that voice belonged to before she saw him. And when Daniel Kong stepped into view from the hallway behind the lobby, the atmosphere did not grow louder, it grew heavier, as if the space itself adjusted around his presence. He did not rush, did not show urgency, each step measured, controlled, his dark suit untouched by the rain that still clung to Amara's sleeves, his gaze steady, focused not on the room, not on the staff, but on the small figure standing near the threshold holding a damp $5 bill in both hands as if it required protection. "I asked you something," he said again, his tone unchanged, and this time Amara turned. She had never seen him before, not in person, not clearly, only in fragments of stories and quiet warnings, but she knew immediately that he was the one her father had spoken about. Not because of what he wore, not because of the way others reacted, but because of the way the room stopped moving around him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Daniel studied her the way he studied everything, looking for patterns, for inconsistencies, for signs of something rehearsed, something constructed. But what he saw did not align with anything he expected. A child who did not step back, who did not look away, whose hands trembled slightly but did not hide, and whose eyes, though red, held something steady that he could not immediately define. "Why did you come back?" he asked once more, and this time his voice was quieter, not softer, but more focused, as if the question mattered now in a way it had not before. Amara looked down at the bill for a brief second, then back up at him, and when she answered, there was no hesitation, no attempt to shape her words into something more convincing. She simply told him the truth as she understood it. "Because it is mine," she said, her voice small, but clear, "and I still need it." The answer was simple, almost too simple, and for a moment Daniel said nothing, because it did not match the expectation he had formed. It did not fit into any narrative he had already decided on, and that alone made it more difficult to dismiss. Behind him, the receptionist shifted slightly, preparing to speak, to explain, to correct what she assumed was a misunderstanding. But Daniel lifted a hand just enough to stop her without looking back. A gesture so minimal it could have been missed, yet it carried more authority than anything spoken in the room so far. His attention remained on Amara, and after a brief pause, he asked, "Who told you to come here?" The question lingered between them, and for the first time since he had stepped into the lobby, there was something beneath his control, not visible, not obvious, but present, a tension that did not belong to power alone. Amara's fingers tightened slightly around the bill, the edges pressing into her skin as if grounding her, and she answered without lowering her gaze. "My dad," she said, and the words landed with a quiet finality that did not match their volume. Daniel's expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes shifted, something small, almost invisible, like a memory brushing against the surface of his thoughts before disappearing again, and he took a slow breath, as if resetting something inside himself before continuing. "What is his name?" he asked, and the question was no longer casual, no longer distant. It carried a weight that even he had not expected. Amara did not hesitate. "Marcus Johnson," she said, and this time, the silence that followed was different. Not empty, not neutral, but filled with something that had just begun to take shape, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but that would not be ignored any longer. The name did not echo in the room, it sank, it settled into the space between them with a weight that no one else seemed to recognize, and for a moment Daniel Kong did not respond, not because he had not heard it, but because he had, and something about the way it landed disrupted the clean lines of thought he relied on, the structure that allowed him to move through decisions without hesitation. And he stood there, still, his gaze fixed on the small girl in front of him as if the answer might change if he looked at her long enough. Marcus Johnson. The syllables were simple, familiar in a distant way, like a word learned long ago and then buried under years of silence, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for something inside him to register the shift. "Say that again," he said, quieter now, the authority still there, but edged with something that did not belong to control. Amara did not flinch, did not question the request. She simply repeated it, exactly the same. Marcus Johnson. And this time, Daniel did not look at her immediately after she spoke. His eyes drifting for just a fraction of a second, not away from her, but inward, toward something he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. The lobby remained silent, the receptionist frozen in place, the guards holding their positions as if waiting for an instruction that had not yet been given. And none of them understood that the moment had already shifted into something else entirely, something that no longer followed the rules they were used to. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not quite steady him the way it usually did, and he looked back at Amara, studying her again, but differently this time, not as a problem to be assessed, not as a situation to be resolved, but as a possibility, a connection he could not yet confirm but could not dismiss either. "What does he do?" he asked, and the question came out more deliberate than before, each word placed carefully, as if the answer mattered in a way that would change everything that came after it. Amara shifted her grip slightly on the $5 bill, her fingers tightening around it as if the memory of her father required something physical to hold on to, and she answered in the same straightforward way she had answered everything else. "He helps people," she said, and then after a brief pause, as if adding something important, "He used to carry them out when things got bad." Daniel's eyes flickered just once, a small movement that passed as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to align something in his mind that had been out of place, enough to pull a fragment of memory into focus, not clear, not complete, but present, a sense of heat, of urgency, of a hand that had reached for him when everything else had been falling apart, and he felt it again, that same pressure at the edge of his thoughts, no longer easy to push away. "Used to?" he repeated quietly, and this time the word carried more than curiosity. It carried an understanding that had not yet been spoken. Amara nodded, her expression unchanged, not because the subject did not matter, but because she had already accepted what she knew. "He is not here anymore," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just a statement that existed the way facts exist when there is nothing left to argue about. Daniel's gaze held on her for a moment longer, then shifted slightly, not to anyone else in the room, but to the space beside her, as if imagining something that was not there, something that had been there once, and the silence stretched again, deeper this time, heavier, because it was no longer about whether the child belonged in this building, it was about whether the man standing in front of her belonged in the story she had just brought with her. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a connection was forming, incomplete but insistent, and Daniel Kong realized, without fully understanding how or why, that this was no longer a situation he could dismiss, because if the name she had spoken was the one he thought it was, then the distance between them was not as wide as it had seemed, and the weight of that possibility was something even he could not ignore.